Hello, spooky friends. This is Kitty, and I've spent the last few weeks luxuriating in Bette Davis movies. Out of her long and illustrious career, only about 10% can be classed as horror. Of those, here are my top 5. We'll be discussing decades-old media, so there will be spoilers. You have been warned. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane smacked the world upside the head. It was a tour de force for Davis. She plays the most deliciously crazy character in Jane Hudson, a vaudeville child star who never made it any further. She's joined by Joan Crawford as Blanche Hudson, her movie star sister, who became paralyzed in a questionable car accident. Jane has been looking after Blanche for decades, slowly descending further into hatred and madness. At first, Blanche can't believe the worst of her sister, even though there's never been any love lost between them. Her early missteps become her undoing. Now, I usually don't believe the press on celebrity rivalries, but the enmity between Crawford and Davis was all too real. They were both women with an edge and competed for the same roles through the 40s, and not in a friendly way. Davis was actually nominated for Best Actress for the role of Jane. Crawford went to every other nominee and graciously offered to accept for them if they couldn't make it and asked them not to vote for Davis. She lost out to Anne Bancroft in The Miracle Worker, but let's face it, a horror movie was never going to win over that. Oh, and Crawford accepted the award on Bancroft's behalf. Directed by Robert Aldrich and written by Lucas Heller based on the novel by Henry Farrell, Baby Jane is brilliant. I do love it, but it's not at the top of my list for a couple of reasons. First, it's hard to understand some of the basic decisions of the story, like a wheelchair user having an upstairs bedroom. She was rich as Croesus when she was first paralyzed. It's nuts those accommodations weren't made. Maybe adding a wheelchair lift that Jane disabled would have made more sense, but no. Blanche just stayed upstairs for 25 years. Second, I hate when stupid drives the plot. This is on the edge, because Blanche wants to believe her sister, but not reaching out when she could very nearly tipped over into dumbass land. Finally, the reveal at the end seemed unnecessary, convoluted, and even a little anticlimactic. Though I will say, the final shot was amazing. I'm struggling, but I will not tell any jokes about bell ringers. 1964's Dead Ringer was a remake of a Mexican film, La Otra. Betty plays identical twins Edie and Maggie. Maggie stole Edie's boyfriend, Frank, when they were young, and the sisters don't see each other again until his funeral nearly 20 years later. Edie now runs a struggling bar and is seeing cop boyfriend Jim. Really, folks, you shouldn't try to pull stuff if your boyfriend is a cop. Maggie is now a rich widow. When Edie discovers Maggie faked a pregnancy to get Frank to marry her, it's the last straw. She invites Maggie over to her flat above the pub, shoots her rotten sister in her rotten head, and uses the body to fake her own suicide. She steps into her rich sister's life with considerable difficulty and is eventually caught out by Maggie's lover. Because, of course, Maggie was cheating on her husband on top of everything. I'm actually not going to spoil this one entirely because, man, there's some delicious irony involved here. The ending was poignant and lovely and bitterly disappointing. I've learned that getting your hopes up in a Bette Davis movie will result in despair. Now, I don't want to say it's aliens. Watcher in the Woods was surprisingly spooky for Disney. It was made in 1980 in the middle of their dark era. A family moves into a new house only to have the two daughters tormented by something supernatural. It seems to be the spirit of the landlord's daughter, who went missing decades before. Davis plays the landlord, Mrs. Aylwood. We're supposed to suspect her of something, but we never really do. The youngest daughter, played by Kyle Richards, yes, Real Housewife Kyle Richards, has something talking through her. The teenager, Lynn Holly Johnson, keeps seeing a blindfolded girl. The parents, played by Carol Baker, who is definitely not Tuesday Weld, and David McCallum, who I had such a crush on when I was a kid, are just basic Disney parents. Directed by John Huff, the film had problems with its initial release and was actually pulled and recut, and a new ending filmed by Vincent McAveety without Huff. The original opening credits apparently played over the melting face of a doll. A little dark there, Mouse. The original miserable ending, where the teenage protagonist disappears, was also too much for audiences. Though it's a bit of a mess, and the teenager yells way too much, I still really enjoyed this film, especially for one small what the F moment. It's completely unremarked in the film, there's no dramatic musical sting, and it doesn't seem to happen again. It's probably an unintentional sequence of pareidolia-inducing coincidence. It starts here, though looking at it again I can barely see it, but it continues here. And it looks like they overlaid creepy puppet faces. If they did this on purpose, nice. Davis was busy in 1964. In Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte, director Robert Aldrich hoped to capitalize on the chemistry between Davis and Crawford once again. Unfortunately, Betty flat out refused to work with Joan again. She was only convinced when she was offered $200K to Crawford's $50K. Or at least, she appeared to be convinced. In truth, she likely never had any intention of working with Crawford. She made her life on set miserable, for example, sitting with the director during Joan's scenes and picking at her performance. Joan finally pled illness and escaped to a clinic. She came back briefly, but immediately left again. The studio finally told Aldrich he either had to replace her or scrap the movie. Exit Joan Crawford, enter Olivia de Havilland. De Havilland was happily living in Switzerland. She didn't want to take Joan's place, and she didn't want to play a bad guy. She did it because Davis wanted her to. I think she did a great job, and the casting against type was part of what made it work. Davis plays Charlotte, a caustic old woman whose married lover was murdered before they could run away together. She was accused but not convicted, and never overcame her grief and the persecution of the community. We open with a boyfriend, played by a very normal Bruce Dern. Talk about casting against type. When we see her again, it's nearly 40 years later, and the city is trying to tear down her mansion to build a bridge. She lives alone, but has a loyal but long-suffering housekeeper, Velma, wonderfully played by Agnes Moorehead. Charlotte still imagines she sees her lover, John, a fantasy that her cousin, de Havilland's Miriam, takes advantage of. With the help of Dr. Bayless, played sleazily by Joseph Cotton, they pull off a great spooky gaslight with ghostly music and rolling heads. The title song, which features heavily in the film, even snagged a top 10 hit for Patti Page. The performances are top-notch and the ending is deeply satisfying. I honestly don't think I would have liked Crawford better than de Havilland. Did you know Bette Davis did a Hammer film? Of course, it only has two things in common with most Hammer films. One, it's horror, and two, Jimmy Sangster wrote it. 1965's The Nanny, based on the book by Evelyn Piper, is a damn masterpiece. And yet, I never want to watch it again. Between Seth Holt's direction and Sangster's script, the sheer discomfort still makes my teeth itch. It's the story of a family who lost a child. The remaining child, Joey, was blamed for the loss, but of course, we all know it was Nanny. Nanny, who never gets another name in the film, is played right on the edge by Davis. Every other character in the film, from the useless mother to the abusive father, is played as a caricature, a hollow shell being puppeted through the plot with only one painted-on face. The movie leaves the family flat only twice, at the beginning and the end, and you would think that would cause claustrophobia, and it does, but really, it's those intentionally cardboard characters that do the heavy lifting. The intractable personalities makes it feel like our protagonist, the child Joey, is pounding at the walls of his cell, but in his own way, he too is an intractable caricature. The tension does finally break, but perhaps not in the way you'd expect. It breaks when we see the only character drawn as complex and human, the nanny herself. I couldn't stop thinking about the nanny for a week after I watched it. The movie is brilliant from beginning to end, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. Davis did other horror movies worth recommending, Burnt Offerings, which I've talked about elsewhere, and The Dark Secret of Harvest Home, which I will likely talk about in the future. Scream Pretty Peggy is okay in a pinch. If you're hunting for other horror movies, beware. Some lists include Phone Call from a Stranger, which sounds like it should be horror. It is in fact a schmaltz fest. They'll also list Return from Witch Mountain, which no. Betty must have owed back taxes to make that one. Thank you, Betty, for being fabulous and making my research joyful.
Research. That's where the joy lies.
And thank you, spooky friends. I love you to death. Good night.